Due to the fact that Fort Pitt currently has their display, and I told you this last year, their display is on powder horns. How long is that still going to be there?
It's through October 1st right now. There's a good chance we may extend it, but for sure through October 1st.
And if you have not been to the Fort Pitt Museum to see the horn display they have there, you really need to, because there are one-of-a-kind pieces that once the display is done, many of them are going to go back into secret hiding places where it will not be visible again. And there's extremely unique pieces there from all aspects of culture and colonial life, including native horns, which are hard to find sometimes, especially to say that this is attributed to a native. So there's some interesting things there. In fact, the one horn even may have some of the gentleman's blood on it from when he was dispatched at the time he was carrying the horn. So there's a lot of cool stuff, is what I'm getting at. So what I asked Mike to do, Mike's not a stranger. He's been with us for many years at Long Hunter as a participant and as a prior speaker. He works as a curator. What is the official title?
Exhibit specialist.
Exhibit specialist. So what that means is
I change light bulbs.
all the hard work and display stuff is attributed to Mike's talent, research abilities, and his artistic capabilities. So really, if anything, go down and see the display to see what Mike has been able to put together down there.
I don't know.
I'm trying to give you a good plug.
Thank you.
The other helpers aren't here, so why should they
That's
get
right.
it?
They
Why
didn't
should
show up, so
they didn't show up, so
I will accept all credit or blame.
But in the research world, it's always kind of funny when you go down to the fort and pop in, and there's Burke at the front desk during slow time, and he's got some journal, and he's got lots of Post-its and bookmarks and stuff in there, and he's got his little journal that he's writing stuff down, so he's constantly doing research into these different aspects that we're interested in. So the one I asked him to come down to talk about is the horns on the PA and Virginia frontier. So without further ado, Mike Burke, thank you.
Thanks, Bill. Thank you guys for having me again. I've been down here several times, like Bill said, as a speaker and participant. This talk, I think I did for the first time, it was probably 8 or 10 years ago, on this similar topic. And there's been so much information come to light in the meantime that I thought it'd be a good time to do kind of a refresher, in conjunction with the exhibit. And particularly for people in this region, I think it's really helpful. It's not always obvious the choice of powder horn that you should be carrying or the type or whatever. So we're going to explore some of the characteristics that make horns from Pennsylvania and Virginia and those frontier regions, whether they're made there or they're used there, different from horns from elsewhere in colonial America. So just to give you a little bit of background about myself, my kind of gateway into this hobby was always through powder horns. When I was a kid, we would go to visit my Aunt Marianne in Vermont, and we'd always take a day trip somewhere, and a lot of the time we ended up at Fort Ticonderoga, which is right on Lake Champlain. It has an unbelievable powder horn collection. If you ever get a chance to go check it out, it certainly is worthwhile. But from the very beginning, I was just mesmerized by the carvings on these horns, and it was something that just kind of resonated with me as this very personal type of artifact. You can see, in some cases the guns that guys carried, but in the case of powder horns, you're very often looking at the actual inscriptions that these guys made. And this may be, in some cases, the only real surviving document associated with a given soldier. And so these things, I think, are very powerful artifacts. When we would go to Fort Ticonderoga, the first time we went there, I bought a, kind of a gift shop powder horn. I was like 12. I spent $10 on it or whatever it was. I brought it home and started to carve into it. And I think I was using Sketchbook 76 as an inspiration for like the types of designs. Soon after that, I found other horns and started doing some horns for friends. This is before I ever shot a muzzleloader. I was sort of interested in horns. It wasn't until 1996 when Jim Dressler's book, the Folk Art of Early America, the engraved powder horn came out, that I really started to look more closely at these horns. And you can see the cover of this horn is just, or the cover of this book is just, covered with antique powder horns, and it just, sets your mind off into how these things were made and when and where. In Jim's book, there were, dozens, if not hundreds of horns pictured in full color. You can see all the detail of the carvings, how they were made. You can see in many cases what tools that were used to do the carvings. Well, that thing does have a hair trigger, doesn't it? Good, very good. And you could see these things up close. And so one of the things I noticed was many, if not most, of the horns in Jim's book and in other publications had an attribution to New York or New England, and there were a handful, maybe 4 or 5 horns in the whole book that were attributable to Pennsylvania or had some Pennsylvania association. Fort Pitt or Philadelphia might have been depicted. So those are the horns that started to intrigue me. And just real quick, in case anybody, this is probably less necessary with this audience than with other crowds, but just to kind of show what a powdered horn is and how it's used. It's a hollow horn container from a bovine animal typically, so a cow, a steer, a bull, in some cases buffalo. The horn itself is hollow. When it's on the animal's head, there's sort of a bony core to that, and there's some cartilaginous junk that holds it all together. The horn itself is made of keratin, and it's like the outer sheath of this protuberance from the animal's head. This end here is typically solid, and then it opens up into this hollow cavity. And the reason this makes a good container is when you bore a hole from here, the solid end, into that hollow cavity, and you cap the other end with wood, you end up with this, basically an air and water tight container that's also non-sparking, and so it's an ideal container for gunpowder, which you have to keep dry. You also notice with the shape of the horn, it fits your side very beautifully, and it's very comfortable to carry for long distances. So horn is a natural kind of choice for that sort of container. What makes a powdered horn, an American powdered horn, different from the European counterpart to that? Europeans often used flasks, which are also made of horn, but you notice that the shape of them is different. There's 2 types of flasks that are mainly used in Europe. There's this type on the left, which is a Germanic horn flask, and it has actually been heated. Horn is a thermoplastic material, so you can heat it to about 400 degrees and manipulate the shape using presses and molds and things like that. So very often these Germanic horns, and also you see it in Scottish horns, are flattened. This one has a little bit of an indication of a ring up here, but it's not actually enough, I don't think, to carry a strap. The plugs are placed, but I don't know that it ever had a staple or anything that you would actually suspend this from your side. I think more likely this went into a pouch or a pocket. So that's kind of an elaborate horn. The one on the left is what you typically see in England and France, and this is a 2-piece molded flask. So this thing's even more complicated to make than the Germanic flask. You take 2 pieces of horn and you actually mold them in 2-piece positive and negative molds to get the front and the back of this thing. Then they're sewn up with brass or copper wire, and the seam is covered with this kind of brass strip. You can see it's got a couple little rings there, so you can suspend that from a cord. So, looking at this picture of this horn in its kind of natural state, if you take away the carving, that looks a lot like it did when it was on the cow's head. this horn in its natural state is such an effective and effortless container, why in the world would you take that thing and make something as complex as this? Why make it more complex than it needs to be? And I think the answer is, in Europe, only certain types of people carry guns on a regular basis. Either you are a hunter or a sportsman, in which case you've got some money and some land, or you're a soldier in an army of some king or some prince. And in either case, I think there's an effort to use wealth as a way to show off the kind of stuff you carry. And so these things are needlessly complicated, but they just show off. If you're an English sportsman, it just shows off your means that you can carry this, beautiful powder flask. If you're in the army of some German principality, and this is, just to be clear, this is probably a hunting horn from Germany, but very often the military horns are done the same way. They're pressed, and sometimes they have an iron charger. If you're an army in one of these, a soldier in one of these armies, there's a desire on the part of the leader to show off, the trappings of wealth in every soldier, who's got the latest and greatest equipment. So that's why. In America, on the other hand, you got all kinds of people running around with guns, and they all need some place to transport their powder. And so I think round, naturally shaped horns become the go-to here in the colonies. So just to show you some characteristics of New York and New England horns, and of all the horns you ever look at, these are by far the most common ones that survived, at least engraved horns. You can see from an early horn of the French and Indian War on up through a horn of the American Revolution, there's a definite design kind of vocabulary that they use. They very often will step the white portion down toward the spout end, and that's because the white is typically on the outside of the horn. The underlying colors are black or caramel or some other color, green sometimes, but it's obvious that they like the contrast between those two, and so they highlight it by stepping down with a file and then carving out the remainder to highlight that transition. Almost all of them have got some sort of a ring up here to attach the spout, and they have various methods of attaching a spout down here. Sometimes it's a staple, sometimes it's a little lobe that extends off the end of the horn that has a couple of holes drilled through it. This one here has actually got the holes drilled right through the rim of the horn itself, and they actually emerge in the face of the plug, and that's a real common one from the period. So these are common New England horns. And this is a horn with a map depiction of the forts in New York and also the Forbes Road that extends east-west through Pennsylvania that was laid out in 1758. So this horn is in Jim's book, and it's also one that we borrowed a couple of years ago for one of our exhibits. So I got a chance to look at it more closely. This thing is huge. It's like this big, just gigantic. Anybody notice anything different right off the bat with this horn as opposed to the New England horns?
The plug in the back, too.
Yeah, the plug, it's got this giant, protruding walnut plug that's turned on a lathe. And that makes it very different from the New England horns, which are handmade from one end to the other. So, in other words, that the plug is typically fitted to the naturally shaped sort of oblong opening of the horn and just shoved in there. And the spout end of these horns is also all worked by hand, by a file and rasps and knives and scrapers and what have you. So on the Forbes Road horn, you notice there's kind of a hybrid of those two techniques. You got a turned plug, but you also have a spout end that is worked entirely by hand. So somebody took the time to sit there and file all that out and to do that decorative scalloped edge. So that's the one thing that I first started to look for in terms of these Pennsylvania horns. Anytime you see a turned plug, that's an indication that this horn might have come from Pennsylvania or maybe Virginia. And so why would you, just to give you an idea of the country that we're talking about here too. I interpret the Virginia, PA backcountry to mean everything from sort of just east of the mountains, over mountains, and into the lands where Fort Pitt is located, and then the closer you get to the Revolution, down the Ohio River Valley, like into Kentucky. So it's the kind of area that we're all portraying most of the time. What makes these horns different? Here's three of them that were either made or used in western Pennsylvania on that PA-Virginia border area. This one has been modified a couple of times, but it's got carvings that depict the Forbes Road. The one at the top is more of a professionally made horn that's made as a military souvenir, but it's got a nice depiction of Fort Pitt on it. The one on the bottom is made at Fort Pitt, I think about 1770. It's a black bison horn. It's only about this big, and it's got a depiction of Fort Pitt on the back of the horn that's engraved. First of all, it's not carved with a knife, it's engraved with a little push graver. This beautiful depiction of Fort Pitt and the forks of the Ohio, and this big spread of arms, cannons and flags and spears and all this stuff. And those cuts are filled in with vermilion pigment, so it's a really neat horn. The one characteristic, aside from those turn plugs, that I would say, if you look at a lot of horns, that makes these horns different is they're all a little bit goofy. They're all a little bit unusual in some ways. This horn, it's hard to tell what it looked like originally, but this is the second plug that it had, and the reason we can tell that when we look closely at the horn is that the carving has been cut at the base and that plug's been replaced. It's also been docked at the upper end and had a flask charger put onto it, so it's been sort of sporterized. That horn at the top's got the turned plug, which is, as we said, is a Pennsylvania characteristic. And the horn at the bottom is just bizarro. It's like there's nothing else. There's one other horn, a bison horn by this carver, and there's a few other horns done on cow or steer horns by this guy. But it's like, you don't see anything like this in New England, typically. It's got a lobe on the end for holding the strap, but it's got the most elaborately carved lobe. These ones are all on display in the exhibit, by the way, if you want to come take a look at them in person. So they're a little bit unusual. They have certain characteristics that set them aside. Turned elements we just talked about. This is another nice shot of a plug from this period. And this one is walnut. This horn's also on display in the exhibit. So the way you fit this plug is you actually heat the base of the horn up and you shove a round form in there to kind of hold the shape, and then you square it up and turn a plug. The significance of this is that if you are looking at these New England horns, which are all kind of filed up and carved up by hand, versus these Pennsylvania horns, if you got a lathe, it's a sign that you're doing production type work. And chances are powder horn plugs are not the only thing you're turning. You know, it's a way that, you know, you're probably turning chair legs and billiard balls and cups and all kinds of other things that are useful, and powder horns is just one thing that you're doing. Oops. So why would you do that to make a powder horn? All these New England horns are sort of, you know, made and decorated, or I say most of them, made and decorated by the guys that carried them, or somebody else who's carving horns to make a little money selling souvenirs. So why would you use a lathe to make a powder horn? And I think it's because you're making a lot of them. Americans are now, were then, and always will be makers. And I think this is one thing that kind of we notice in colonial America happens quite a bit. The way things are supposed to work in the system that the British have set up, it's called mercantilism. The Americans supply raw materials, they send them on ships back to England, the English make them into finished goods, and then they put them back on ships and sell them back to the Americans. Well, I think American craftsmen realized the absurdity of that equation pretty early on, and Philadelphia becomes this hub of craftsmen from all over Europe. This is a French engraving of a horn production shop from the mid-18th century, and these guys are doing all kinds of work. You can see over on the right-hand side, there's a guy who's got a big griddle kind of laid out, a big brazier, where he's heating the horns and turning them and softening them up. Some of these other guys have them on stakes. They're splitting the horns into two pieces. This is a giant vise over here for making combs, so they're pressing these things flat in enormous numbers. One thing you don't see in this is a lathe, but that's in some of the other images from the period. But anyhow, this is a shop that you would also likely have seen in Philadelphia. Philadelphia is the biggest and most important city in colonial America, and it is also this place that draws enormous numbers of craftsmen from England. So almost every week in the Pennsylvania Gazette, you can look and see so-and-so the tailor or the silversmith or the comb maker has just arrived from England and has set up shop at such and such in Philadelphia, and will be happy to provide customers with fine goods at the lowest cost. That's a really common thing that you see. So these craftsmen, fully trained in whatever art they've been trained in, getting on ships, coming to Philadelphia, setting up shops, and basically using their knowledge to transform American manufacturers. Just to give you a little bit of background too about how this all ties into the history of that time period. In 1754, this conflict that we call the French and Indian War begins. There's a whole series of wars that France fights with England throughout the 18th century. The French and Indian War is the one that's most familiar to us, but it's the last in that series, and it's the kind of decisive battle for control of North America. Basically what happens is France and England are both interested in the Ohio Valley, and it's actually the colony of Virginia that comes into sort of direct contact with the French. George Washington is out there as kind of an agent of the Virginia government in 1754, fires on this party of French soldiers. One of them happens to be the brother of the commander of Fort Duquesne, etc. Sparks this war that consumes much of the subsequent decade. Braddock's defeat in 1755. The French have control of the forks of the Ohio, where Pittsburgh is located today. The English want to get control of it, and so they send this army under Edward Braddock in 1755. Fort Duquesne is supposed to be his first objective. From there, he's going to go up, seize control of the French forts on the Allegheny River, and then on up to Quebec, Niagara, then Quebec, then Louisbourg, and basically tie everything up in a nice bow and head home to England, having conquered the French. Well, he makes it, I don't know if you guys are familiar with Pittsburgh geography, but he makes it about as far as the site of Kennywood Park, which is on the Monongahela River, just a few miles from Pittsburgh. The French at that time at Fort Duquesne decide to launch this sort of last-ditch effort to harass the British column, delay its advance. So it's a party of 600 or 800 French, mostly Indians, who go out and attack Braddock's column head-on, and not only do they slow them down, they actually rout Braddock's entire army. So that is an epic delay for the British, and it's not for another 3 years that they get another chance to try and take control of Fort Duquesne at the point. In 1758, they launch another expedition. This time they come from Philadelphia, and the expedition is under General John Forbes. At points all along this road, they build forts. The road they actually call the communication, because it's their kind of lifeline to Philadelphia. And they march very methodically with 6,000 or 7,000, mostly provincial troops across Pennsylvania, and they take Fort Duquesne on November 25th, 1758. And within 2 days of that, before there's ever a Fort Pitt or anything else constructed there, they've named the place Pittsburgh in honor of William Pitt. The Forbes Road is, like I say, a lifeline to the east, and soon after the British take control, this becomes the main supply line, and so you see all sorts of things. There's a great journal from Fort Littleton in 1759 with this guy who's kind of watching everybody who's coming through with pack horses and stuff like that up and down the Forbes Road, and what they're taking there, which is oftentimes supplies, a lot of liquor, stuff like that, and what they're bringing back, which are furs and skins, and headed to Philadelphia. So the Forbes Road is the key to this whole operation. In 1758, they're ramping up, production for this expedition, and there's all sorts of demand for military products. They, in England, they're kind of meeting the demand. You can see commercially made muskets that are produced around that time, and I think that the American craftsmen start to try to fill that demand as well. This is the type of guy who is making powder horns and things like that in Philadelphia at the time. This is a great 17th century, late 17th century image of this guy's called it's a German image, he said Wildruf and Horn Dreher. So a Wildruf is a musical instrument that's made out of turned pieces of horn. I think you can sort of see, there's parts of one here. And a Horn Dreher is a horn turner. So you can see in the background on the upper left, that's his spring pole lathe, and that's one of his main tools that he uses. In the foreground, you see this guy's got a gigantic vise with a form on it and a horn jammed on the end, and he's got this huge rasp that he's using to clean up the surface of this horn, and all around him baskets and bits and pieces of different horns, and all these things. The idea is these guys go through tons and tons of horns every year, and the idea is to use every part of every horn in some way, so you're not wasting anything. So if you're already set up to make all this other stuff, cups and combs and all these other things out of horns, then powder horns become a natural addition to your thing. And in 1758, that becomes a really good time to start introducing powder horns, because there's this expedition that's going west to try to take Fort Duquesne. Whoops, sorry. Here's the quote. So Forbes is the general, and he's in charge of the expedition. Colonel Henry Bouquet, whose name is probably familiar to a lot